The known unknowns, the things that we know happened, but we don't know what they were. So the pivotal to the whole episode and what happened to the school is what was said by the Care Inspectorate to the Registrar of Independent Schools and then passed on to John Swinney, caused him to take enforcement action. So that was on the 2nd of November. And we're not allowed to see that. So something was said about the school and possibly said about myself, almost inevitably said about myself. I'm not allowed to know. And I'm not allowed to challenge in terms of natural justice, whether it was true. And I'm sure it was appalling, but it won't have been true. But I don't know what that was because the education minister then imposed conditions on the school. So it must have been very, very serious, but untrue. So that's the first thing. The second thing was there were a series of events that occurred between the 2nd of November and the 7th that I don't know about. And this is contact between the Board of Governors with the Slack group and the Care Inspectorate. And I'm not allowed to know. And I know that that contact must have occurred because on the 2nd, when I phoned with a Slack to say, look, everything's fine, nothing's happened in school, no allegations, no child protection matters, everyone's safe, staff have to return to work, all good. Then at that point, Jude Jones said, but the Care Inspectorate are taking enforcement action. And then on the 5th, with the Slack pulled out, having had no concerns about the school prior to that. So something happened, and there was something about the quality of contact between those groups that led to that decision. And it may well have been what we suspect, which is that the Slack wanted to pull out because they weren't going to be allowed, the Care Inspectorate were going to block their registration anyway, regardless of what happened with that child protection matter, in inverted commas. And this was the vehicle for them to do that. But something must have been said to Andrew Kuby because he had the same information everyone else had, which was that nothing happened. It was a non-event. I mean, literally nothing happened. So on the 7th, I was suspended for something that hadn't happened, for a responsibility that had been apportioned to me, but which I didn't have, when I had no contract or job specification, and when all those responsibilities lay with someone else within the school anyway. And why he did that is extremely interesting. And the question is whether he was stupid enough to make that decision himself, or whether he was told to make that decision. And that's critical. Either he was extraordinarily stupid, didn't even think to check what my responsibilities were, or someone said that I had made a huge error. But even then, he should have said, well, an error is not a cause for enforcement action. If it's and certainly from the lower level, if it was a professional judgment, then you can't take enforcement action. If it was an error, you can't take enforcement action unless the child has been harmed in some way. So why he would then suspend me on what was clearly at that time a spurious allegation is extraordinarily strange. But then I was suspended, and then enforcement action was taken and conditions imposed on the school. And on the 8th, there was a meeting between the Care Inspectorate and Andrew Kuby and others, I think, and Education Scotland were there. And after that meeting, Kuby said to me that they had grave reservations about the management of the school. And, lastly, he said that I was a risk to pupils. But I'm not allowed to know what was said in that meeting. They could have said that I was a paedophile, that I had done huge harm to young people, when it was clearly not the case. So I don't know what was said at that meeting, and I'm not allowed to know what was said at that meeting. There were two further things that came from that meeting on the 8th of November 2018. One was there was an article in the Herald on the 20th of November which said the school closed after a damning inspection report, written by Andrew Denham. And of course, there was no inspection on the 8th of November. So the only inspection that took place was in May, in which even the care inspectorate said the pupils felt safe, well looked after, had good relationships with staff, etc., etc. But that the article written by Andrew Denham also talked about inappropriate behaviour between staff, and yet the local child protection investigation said there was no evidence of any inappropriate behaviour whatsoever. So someone, presumably the care inspector, briefed the press, A, that there had been an inspection, and B, that they had found that there were failures in child protection, that there had been inappropriate behaviour between staff and pupils, etc., etc. In other words, it wasn't reported as, in terms of the evidence that was available at the time, it was just fabricated. But what they also said in a press briefing was there had been a complaint, and that complaint had been upheld. Now, I never saw a complaint. I don't even know the nature of the complaint. I'm assuming that it related to the anonymous letter that the disgruntled member of staff had written to the care inspector. To this day, May 2020, I've never seen that complaint, so I don't know what was complained about. And in terms of due process, natural justice, the care inspector's own procedures, the protocols of regulatory authorities within Scotland, you can't uphold a complaint without giving those who have been complained about an opportunity to know A, what that complaint is, and B, what their response is. So it's extraordinary. It is like living in Nigeria or Zimbabwe. It feels like that, because a lot of what's happened has been completely alien to any due process of law, natural justice, human rights, etc., etc. So that's another thing that I still don't know what the complaint was after all this time. And I've written to the Board of Governors asking for this information, and just refused to give it to me, which is even more bizarre because I was working for them very loyally, certainly very loyally in terms of the school. And when I've asked to know what my reporting responsibilities were, where my failures were, all this sort of stuff, just refuse point blank to respond, which is absolutely bizarre. So there are a lot of known unknowns, pieces of information that and we've tried in terms of so we were putting complaints to Care Inspectorate and Education Scotland, etc., putting complaints about the conduct of the final week of term. What we've had back so far is that the Education Scotland say it's all the fault of the governors, Care Inspectorate say it's all the fault of the governors, Perth and Kinross Council say it's all the fault of the school, of what happened in the final week, even though it's very clear that decisions taken weren't taken by school staff. The point in those complaints was not to get a response. Because we knew fine well that we wouldn't get honest answers from any of those bodies. It was more the real point was to get to the stage where we could say, look, this isn't a localized issue. This isn't one or two maverick care inspectors like Alison Jameson or Sandra Wright or whoever making things up. This was strategic. It goes to the heart of those organisations. So the Care Inspectorate knew what they were doing was unlawful, but did it. Education Scotland knew that what they were doing was going to cause harm to young people, but did it. It was done for a purpose. And those in higher positions knew exactly what they were doing. So the reason for those complaints was to ensure that when it goes to court, no one can suggest it was a mistake. It was deliberate and it was planned. So the known unknowns will be revealed, but we'll have to go to court. We'll have to get court orders, and it's extraordinarily tiresome to have to go through that whole process and expensive. But ultimately, we won't be paying, because ultimately it'll be the Care Inspectorate and Education Scotland and Perth and Kinross Council who will pay, because they have clearly acted unlawfully, and that's why we're going through what we're going through at the moment. Yeah, the final known unknown is exactly what was said to the Board of Governors, and we've got a fairly clear idea of it from the transcripts of the meetings between the governors and staff and governors and parents, where they said there was a very clear ultimatum laid down by the care inspector that the school had to close within 5 days. And that's not with, I don't think that's within dispute. That ultimatum was made. Why that ultimatum was made, given that none of the criteria necessary for taking enforcement action, let alone closure action, had been evidenced, is what obviously concerns us, because you have to have very clear evidence of failings. You have to have very clear evidence of poor outcomes. And if the governors are stating on the one hand that to challenge the idea that children were not looked after or cared for was obscene, that it was obscene to question the level of care in the school, and yet say, but you can take enforcement action and you can close a school, and not challenge that notion, is what has given rise to a lot of concerns about the actions of the governors and what was motivating them at the time, and whether all the governors, in fact, were fully appraised of the situation, whether they had an understanding of the legal framework in which the care inspector could act. And what I think has shocked us all at the time, and gave rise to members of staff at way back in December 2018 saying, well, why didn't you petition for a judicial review? This is members of staff saying that, not governors, you'd thought would be in the position where they would want to defend the school. But it looked very much at the time, and possibly even more so now, that the governors just capitulated. They just ran away from the school for whatever reason. And they didn't defend the 51 members of staff and the 25 families and the concept of the school, and Veronica Linklater's vision of what it should be, that they just decided to abandon that for whatever reason. So there are a lot of theories around why that happened, but we have no answers. So there are a set of known unknowns around how and why a care inspectorate can deliver an ultimatum such as that, and then how and why a board of governors would not only run away from their responsibilities, their duty of care to staff and their duty of care to pupils, and their, I would say, duty of care to Veronica Linklater's mission, but then try to pin the blame on managers within the school and say, well, it was my fault, Angie's fault, for something that we couldn't have done. And that I think has given rise to a huge amount of concern from the whole school community.